The box arrived on a Tuesday, a simple cardboard container with my grandmother's name scrawled across the top in my aunt's hasty handwriting. Eleanor had passed 3 months ago, and the family had been slowly distributing her possessions according to her meticulous will. This particular box, however, wasn't mentioned in any document. "Found this in the attic," my aunt's note read. "Thought you might want it, given your interest in family history." I placed it on my kitchen table, eyeing it cautiously. My apartment in San Francisco felt particularly quiet that evening, the fog rolling in early and muffling the usual street noise. I poured myself a glass of wine before slicing through the packing tape. Inside was a collection of old photographs, letters, and a leather-bound journal that I recognized as my grandmother's. What caught my attention immediately, however, was a large framed photograph at the bottom of the box. I lifted it carefully, wiping away a layer of dust. It was a school photograph, the kind taken of entire classes in the early 20th century. The back had a date stamp: Oak Ridge Elementary, San Bernardino County, California, May 1926. The children were arranged in 3 neat rows, their faces solemn, as was customary for photographs of that era. Their teacher, a stern-looking woman with her hair pulled tightly back, stood to the side. My grandmother would have been 8 years old in 1926. I scanned the photograph, looking for her familiar features among the children. After a moment, I spotted her in the middle row, 5th from the left. Even as a child, she had that distinctive Peterson chin that had been passed down through generations. I smiled, tracing my finger over her image. That's when I noticed something strange about the photograph. In the back row, 3rd from the right, stood a child, unlike the others. Where there should have been a face, there was only a blurred, featureless oval. At first, I assumed it was damage to the photograph, or perhaps the child had moved during the exposure, but the rest of the image was remarkably clear, preserved almost perfectly for nearly a century. I retrieved my magnifying glass from my desk drawer and examined the anomaly more closely. The child's body was perfectly defined, a girl in a dark dress with what appeared to be a white collar. Her hands were folded primly in front of her, but where her face should have been was just emptiness. Not blurred, not damaged, but absent, as if someone had meticulously erased every feature. A chill ran through me despite the warmth of my apartment. I set the photograph down and picked up my grandmother's journal, flipping through the yellowed pages until I found entries from 1926. Most were mundane childhood observations, games played, lessons learned, small dramas of elementary school life. Then on May 15th, just a few days after the date on the photograph, I found an entry that made my breath catch. "Mary didn't come to school again today. Miss Holloway says we're not to talk about it, but everyone is whispering. Mama says sometimes God calls little angels back to heaven early. I don't understand why he would take Mary, though. I don't think heaven needed her as much as we do." I stared at the photograph again, at the faceless child in the back row. Something cold and unpleasant settled in the pit of my stomach. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed, making me jump. I reached for my laptop, suddenly determined to learn more about Oak Ridge Elementary and what might have happened in the spring of 1926. As the screen illuminated my darkening apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced at the photograph again. Was it my imagination, or had the faceless child somehow shifted position? Sleep eluded me that night. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that featureless void where a child's face should have been. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and returned to my research. Oak Ridge Elementary no longer existed. The building had been demolished in the 1960s to make way for a shopping center, but the San Bernardino Historical Society maintained extensive records online. I scrolled through digitized newspapers from 1926, searching for any mention of the school, or more specifically, a student named Mary. It took hours, but finally, buried in the May 18, 1926 edition of the San Bernardino Daily Sun, I found it. The article was small, just a few paragraphs at the bottom of page 7. Child's death shocks local school. The community of Oakridge is in mourning following the tragic death of 8-year-old Mary Sullivan, a student at Oakridge Elementary. Mary was discovered in the school's basement storage room on Friday afternoon by janitor Harold Jenkins. Authorities have ruled the death accidental, though details have not been disclosed out of respect for the family. Mary is survived by her parents, Thomas and Elizabeth Sullivan, and younger brother James. Funeral services will be held at St. Catherine's Church on Tuesday. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. The timing aligned perfectly with my grandmother's journal entry. I dug deeper, searching for more information about Mary Sullivan and her family. Census records from 1920 showed the Sullivans living on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from where my grandmother's family had resided. Thomas Sullivan was listed as a bank manager, his wife a homemaker. Mary would have been 2 at the time of the census, her brother just an infant. I couldn't find much else until I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to San Bernardino County history. A thread titled Oakridge Elementary Mysteries caught my attention. The original post was from 2015. My grandfather attended Oakridge Elementary in the 1920s and always told a strange story about a girl who died there. According to him, they found her in the basement with her face completely gone, like it had been wiped away somehow. The official story was that she fell, but my grandfather said the teachers were acting strange for weeks afterward, and some kids claimed to see the girl in the hallways, always facing away from them. Anyone else heard similar stories or know what really happened at Oakridge in 1926? There were only a few replies, mostly dismissing it as urban legend or suggesting mundane explanations for the death. But one response, from a user named HistoryHunter57, sent another chill through me. My grandmother was a student there at that time. She never spoke about it willingly, but once, when she had dementia near the end of her life, she became very agitated about the girl with no face and how they shouldn't have taken her picture. She insisted the camera stole what was left of her soul. We always thought it was just confused ramblings. I glanced at the school photograph still lying on my table. The first rays of dawn were creeping through my window, casting a pale light across the glass. I could have sworn, just for a moment, that the faceless child had turned her head slightly toward me. I quickly shut my laptop and went to make coffee, my hands shaking so badly I spilled grounds all over the counter. When I returned to the living room, steeling myself to look at the photograph again, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A small puddle of water had formed beneath the frame, as if it had been outside in the rain. But it hadn't rained in San Francisco for weeks, and the box had been in my dry apartment all night. I touched the liquid with my fingertip. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and slightly viscous. As I pulled my hand away, I noticed that the water seemed to be seeping from behind the glass of the frame itself, from the spot where the faceless child stood. I called in sick to work and spent the day at the San Francisco Public Library, searching for information about Oakridge Elementary and Mary Sullivan. By the afternoon, I'd compiled enough material to fill a small notebook, but the details remained frustratingly vague. What I did learn was that 1926 had been a tumultuous year for the school. Besides Mary Sullivan's death in May, a fire had damaged the East Wing in July, and the principal, Dr. Howard Blackwood, had resigned unexpectedly in August. The school newspaper mentioned a tragic spring and a cloud hanging over Oakridge, but specifics were conspicuously absent. I found Mary Sullivan's obituary, which described her as a bright artistic child with a kind heart, but offered no details about her death beyond calling it a terrible accident. The Sullivan family had moved from San Bernardino by the end of the year, disappearing from local records. On my way home, I stopped at an antique shop in the Marina district, one that specialized in historical photography. The owner, A grey-haired man named Gerald examined my grandmother's school photograph with professional interest. "Beautiful preservation," he murmured, running a gloved finger along the frame. "These class photos were quite common, but finding one in this condition is rare." I hesitated before pointing to the faceless child. "What about this? Is this some kind of damage or exposure problem?" Gerald frowned, adjusting his glasses. "No, that's not typical photographic degradation. It's too precise." He looked up at me. "Where did you say you got this?" "My grandmother's belongings. She was in the class." He nodded slowly, still studying the anomaly. There were superstitions about photography back then. Some believed cameras could capture more than just images, they could trap parts of the soul. He gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. "There's actually a term for this kind of photographic anomaly, face void. It's extremely rare, but there are other historical examples." "What causes it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Gerald shrugged. "Officially, unknown. Some kind of chemical reaction with the development process, perhaps." He paused, then added, "Unofficially? Well, there are stories." "What kind of stories?" He carefully handed the photograph back to me. "Stories about subjects who died shortly before or after the photograph was taken. Some photographers claimed the face would disappear from the negative if the person's soul was in transition, let's say." I thought about the dates. The photograph taken in early May, Mary's death on or before May 15th. What if the person was already dead when the photograph was taken? Gerald gave me a strange look. "That would be impossible, wouldn't it?" He hesitated. "Unless you're suggesting—" I didn't let him finish. I thanked him for his time and left, the photograph tucked safely in my bag. But Gerald's parting words followed me home. "Be careful with old photographs," he'd called after me. "They have a way of preserving more than just memories." Back in my apartment, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, thick, with a musty scent like wet earth and old leaves. And it was cold, so cold I could see my breath forming clouds in front of me. The photograph was exactly where I'd left it on the table, but the water, or whatever that liquid had been, had spread, soaking into the wooden tabletop. Worse, the glass of the frame had developed a crack running diagonally across the image, precisely through the spot where the faceless child stood. As I approached, I noticed something else. Small, wet footprints led from the table across my hardwood floor, disappearing at the entrance to the hallway. They were the size of a child's feet. My phone rang, making me jump. It was my aunt. "Did you get the box I sent?" she asked without preamble. "Yes," I replied, my eyes fixed on those small, damp footprints. "I've been looking through it. There's a school photograph." "Listen to me carefully," my aunt interrupted, her voice tense. "Your grandmother made me promise never to show that photograph to anyone. I shouldn't have sent it to you. I wasn't thinking clearly after the funeral." "Aunt Sarah, what's going on? What do you know about Mary Sullivan?" There was a long silence on the line. When my aunt spoke again, her voice had dropped to a whisper. "How do you know that name?" "She's in the photograph, the child with no face." Another silence, longer this time. I could hear my aunt's ragged breathing. "That's not possible," she finally said. "Mary Sullivan wasn't in that photograph. She was absent that day. She was already—" The line went dead. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against my windows like a living thing trying to get in. I tried calling my aunt back, but the call wouldn't connect. I turned slowly toward the hallway, toward those wet footprints that shouldn't exist. From somewhere deep in my apartment, I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of a child humming. I spent the night at a hotel downtown, the photograph locked in the trunk of my car. I'd grabbed my laptop and a few essentials, leaving everything else behind. The humming had grown louder as I packed, coming from my bedroom closet. I hadn't opened it to look. In the sterile safety of the hotel room, I continued my research. This time, I focused on photographic anomalies and the history of spirit photography. Most of what I found was pseudoscientific nonsense or obvious hoaxes, but a few scholarly articles discussed the psychological impact of photography in the early 20th century. One paper, published in the Journal of American Folklore, examined face voids specifically. While most alleged paranormal photographic phenomena can be attributed to double exposures or development errors, the face void represents a more complex case. These rare anomalies, in which a subject's facial features appear completely absent while the rest of their form remains intact, have been documented across different photographers, equipment, and development techniques. What makes these cases particularly intriguing is their frequent association with subjects who experienced unusual or traumatic deaths, often within days of the photograph being taken. I scrolled through the accompanying images. A wedding party from 1887 with a faceless bridesmaid, a military unit from 1943 with one soldier's features completely erased, a family portrait from 1912 where a young boy's face was just a blank oval. In each case, the researcher had documented deaths corresponding to the faceless subjects. At 2 a.m., I received a text from my aunt. "Burn it. Don't look at it anymore. Coming to SF tomorrow. Will explain everything." I tried calling her again, but still couldn't get through. Sleep eventually claimed me, but my dreams were troubled. I was running through the halls of a school I'd never seen, following the sound of a child's laughter. Every classroom I passed was filled with students, all turned to stare at me with blank, featureless faces. At the end of the hall stood a small figure in a dark dress with a white collar, facing away from me. "Mary!" I called out in the dream. The figure slowly began to turn. I woke with a gasp, sunlight streaming through the hotel curtains. My phone showed 3 missed calls from my aunt and a text. "Landed. Meeting you at your apartment at noon. Don't bring the photograph." I checked out of the hotel and drove back to my apartment building, deliberately leaving the photograph locked in my car trunk. As I approached my door, I noticed water seeping out beneath it, pooling in the hallway. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was standing outside her apartment, staring at the growing puddle. "Did you leave a faucet running?" she asked, concerned. "It started about an hour ago." I shook my head, my mouth dry. "I haven't been home all night." Mrs. Chen frowned. "Well, someone's been in there. I heard footsteps all night, back and forth, back and forth. I almost called the police, but I thought maybe you had a guest." My hands trembled as I unlocked the door. The apartment was freezing, the air thick with that same earthy smell, now tinged with something else, something metallic and unpleasant. Water covered the floor, soaking the carpets and warping the hardwood. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the walls themselves were weeping. My aunt was already waiting inside, standing in the center of my flooded living room. Her face was ashen, her clothes soaked. "You brought it here," she said accusingly, "after all my grandmother did to contain it." "I didn't. It's still in my car," I stammered. She shook her head slowly. "It doesn't matter where the photograph is now. She's already here." As if in response, the humming started again, a simple childish melody coming from my bedroom. My aunt's eyes widened in fear. "We need to leave," she whispered. "Now." "Not until you tell me what's happening," I insisted, though every instinct was screaming at me to run. My aunt grabbed my arm, her fingers digging painfully into my skin. "Your grandmother was there that day in 1926. She saw what happened to Mary Sullivan. They all did. What happened to her? Mary didn't die in an accident. She was changed." My aunt's voice shook. "The teacher brought in a man to take their class photograph, but he wasn't just a photographer. He was experimenting with something he called soul capturing. He believed he could preserve more than images." The humming grew louder, and the water at our feet began to move, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns. "The children were arranged for the photograph," my aunt continued, her eyes fixed on my bedroom door. "But something went wrong when he took Mary's picture. The camera, it did something to her. Your grandmother said one moment Mary was there, normal and whole, and the next—" She swallowed hard. The next, she was screaming, clawing at her face as it just disappeared. Not her skin or flesh, but her features. Everything that made her recognizable, like her identity had been erased. "That's not possible," I whispered. "They found her body in the basement later. She'd fallen or jumped down the stairs in panic, but by then her face was completely gone, just smooth, blank skin." The bedroom door began to open slowly. The photographer disappeared that same day, taking his equipment with him, but he left behind the class photograph. In it, Mary appeared normal, except to those who had been present that day. To them, to your grandmother, Mary had no face in the image, just as she had no face in death. Water surged around our ankles, the current suddenly stronger. Your grandmother stole the photograph, hoping to protect the other children. She believed as long as she kept it safe, Mary's spirit would remain trapped inside it. For decades it seemed to work. But now, a small figure stood in the bedroom doorway. A girl in a dark dress with a white collar, her hands folded primly before her. Where her face should have been was only a smooth, blank surface, like skin stretched over an egg. "You've let her out," my aunt whispered. We backed toward the apartment door, but it slammed shut with such force that the walls shook. The faceless girl, Mary, remained motionless in the bedroom doorway, water pooling around her small, bare feet. "What does she want?" I gasped, fumbling behind me for the doorknob. My aunt's eyes never left the child's form. To be seen, to be known, to be complete again. The humming had stopped. In its place came a sound like rushing water, or perhaps wind through trees, a hollow, empty noise that seemed to emanate not from the child, but from the void where her face should have been. "Mary," my aunt said softly, taking a careful step forward, "we're not the ones who hurt you." The featureless head tilted slightly, as if in contemplation. Then slowly, a hand rose to touch the blank expanse. The fingers pressed against the smooth skin, pushing inward, as if testing the resistance of a membrane. To my horror, the surface began to yield, fingertips disappearing into the void, as if pressing into thick clay. The child's other hand rose, both now digging into the emptiness, pulling and stretching at nothingness. "Don't look," my aunt hissed, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Where the child's fingers breached the void, darkness spilled out. Not liquid or gas, but something else. Something that seemed to consume the light around it. It spread across the blank face, forming a gaping hole that widened as the small hands pulled at its edges. From within that impossible darkness came a voice, high and childlike, but distorted, as if speaking through water. "Give it back," the voice gurgled. "My face. He took my face. The photographer," my aunt said, her voice shaking. "Harold Jenkins. He's the one who took your photograph, who took your face." The darkness churned. "Not him, her." The child's blank head swiveled, and I felt with terrifying certainty that she was looking directly at me. "She has it now." "I don't," I protested weakly. "I don't have anything of yours." But even as I said it, I felt a strange sensation spreading across my own face, a tightness, as if my skin were being gently pulled. I raised my hands to touch my cheeks and found them cold, numb. My aunt screamed, "Your face, it's changing!" I stumbled to the hall mirror, my heart pounding. What I saw made my legs give way beneath me. My features were blurring, the details of my face softening like wax, held too close to flame. My eyes, nose, mouth, all gradually flattening, merging into the surrounding skin. "Stop it!" my aunt shouted at the child. "She's innocent. She's not part of this." The faceless girl took a step forward, water rippling outward from her feet. "Not innocent. Blood of blood. She carries what was stolen." Understanding dawned on my aunt's face. The photograph. The camera didn't just take Mary's face, it transferred it. To the negative, to the photograph itself. She turned to me, her eyes wide. "And you've been studying it, focusing on it, connecting with it. Mary thinks you've absorbed what was taken from her." I tried to speak, but my mouth was nearly gone now, the opening just a slight depression in the increasingly smooth surface of my face. A muffled sound of panic escaped from what remained. The child moved closer, that terrible void in her face churning with darkness. "Give it back," the watery voice insisted. My aunt lunged forward suddenly, placing herself between us. "Leave her alone. Take me instead." The child paused, the darkness in her non-face swirling faster. Then, with a movement too quick to follow, she reached out and grasped my aunt's wrist. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Where the child's fingers touched my aunt's skin, the flesh seemed to dissolve, revealing not blood and bone, but empty darkness beneath. The void spread up my aunt's arm like ink through water, consuming her from the point of contact outward. My aunt didn't scream. She stood perfectly still, watching with strange resignation as her body was hollowed out from within, becoming a shell filled with the same darkness that churned within the child's face. When it reached her neck and began to creep upward, she turned to me one last time. Her voice, like the child's, now sounded distant and waterlogged. "Run!" she gurgled. "Find the camera. End this." Then the darkness claimed her face, and my aunt was gone, replaced by a perfect silhouette of emptiness in her shape. The child turned toward me again, but the door behind me suddenly burst open. Mrs. Chen stood in the hallway, her eyes wide with shock at the flooded apartment. "What in the world?" she began, but stopped short when she saw the faceless child and the dark silhouette that had been my aunt. The distraction was all I needed. I bolted past Mrs. Chen down the hallway and toward the stairs. Behind me I heard a splash, and Mrs. Chen's scream cut suddenly short. I didn't look back. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my vision blurred by my still transforming face. As I pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of a small figure standing in the entrance to my apartment building, water cascading around her like a personal rain cloud. I drove aimlessly for hours until the numbness in my face began to recede. By sunset, I could feel my features returning, solidifying. Whatever connection had been formed was weakening with distance, but I knew it was temporary. In the trunk of my car, sealed in its cracked frame, the photograph of Oakridge Elementary waited, and within it, a child with no face watched with eyes that existed only in memory, patient, after nearly a century of waiting. I needed to find that camera. I needed to end this. But first, I needed to understand how it all began. San Bernardino County Archives was housed in a brutalist concrete building on the outskirts of the city. I'd driven through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee, my hands constantly straying to my face to reassure myself that my features remained intact. The archivist, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, raised an eyebrow when I requested all available information about Harold Jenkins and Oakridge Elementary from 1926. "Quite specific," she remarked. "Working on a book?" I nodded, not trusting myself to elaborate. My phone had been ringing intermittently throughout the morning, calls from my landlord, from Mrs. Chen's daughter, from the San Francisco police. I'd ignored them all. Patricia returned an hour later with a cart of materials, county employment records, school board minutes, local newspaper microfilm, and a small collection of personal papers donated by Jenkins' daughter in the 1980s. "You're in luck," Patricia said. "His daughter left quite a bit of material, said she wanted the historical record to be clear, whatever that meant." I started with the employment records. Harold Jenkins had been hired as the janitor at Oakridge Elementary in September 1925. Prior to that, he'd worked as a photographer's assistant in Los Angeles, though the details were sparse. His employment at Oakridge ended abruptly in May 1926, listed simply as terminated with no explanation. The school board minutes from May 20th, 1926, included a brief, cryptic reference, Discussion of recent tragedy and related personnel matter. Decision to terminate HJ effective immediately. Decision to remove and destroy all photographic equipment found on premises. The newspaper microfilm yielded little beyond what I'd already found online. The sanitized account of Mary Sullivan's accidental death and a small follow-up piece a week later, noting that the school would be closed for several days for cleaning and necessary repairs. I saved Jenkins' personal papers for last. They were contained in a single archival box, mostly financial records, a few letters, and a leather-bound journal similar to my grandmother's but much more worn. As I carefully turned the brittle pages, a narrative began to emerge that chilled me, despite the warmth of the archive room. Jenkins had not been a simple janitor. He had been a photographer obsessed with capturing what he called the essence of his subjects. His early entries detailed experiments with various chemical processes, modifications to camera equipment, and philosophical musings about the nature of identity. "The face is not merely a physical arrangement of features," he wrote in one entry from 1924, "but the window to the soul itself. If one could capture not just the light reflected from the face, but the very essence it projects, what mysteries might be revealed?" His writings grew increasingly erratic after he began working at Oak Ridge. He became fixated on the children, particularly those he described as having pure souls or untainted essences. The entry from May 10, 1926, the day the class photograph was taken, was lengthy and disturbing. "Today I implemented the modifications. Selenium compound applied to plate as theorized. Principal Blackwood believes I am merely assisting the regular photographer, who conveniently fell ill yesterday. The children were arranged as usual, though I positioned subject MS precisely where the focal point would intersect with the selenium boundary. The exposure was made at exactly 10:17 a.m. Equipment functioned as designed, though there was unexpected feedback during the crucial moment, a pulse of energy that I could feel through the apparatus. Subject MS showed immediate adverse reaction. The effect on her physical form was more pronounced than anticipated. Containment became impossible when subject fled the scene. Discovery of subject's body occurred at 2:43 p.m. Examination confirmed complete transference had occurred. The essence was successfully captured, though the negative shows unexpected anomalies. Must proceed with caution now. Others are suspicious, particularly the Peterson girl who was seated near subject MS. She saw too much. Witnessed the moment of transference. Cannot risk exposure. Will secure the negative and prints tonight after school closes. The journal ended abruptly there. The final pages had been torn out. Patricia approached as I was carefully returning the journal to its box. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "Do you know what happened to Harold Jenkins after he left Oak Ridge?" She frowned. "No official record, but there's a local story that he became something of a recluse, living in a cabin up in the San Bernardino Mountains. His daughter's donation letter mentioned that he continued his photographic experiments until his death in 1958. Did she donate any of his equipment? His cameras?" Patricia shook her head. "No equipment, just the papers, though," she hesitated, "there is one other thing, if you're really interested in Oak Ridge. We have a collection of artifacts from the school that were recovered when it was demolished in the 60s. No one's requested to see them in years." My heart raced. "I'd very much like to see those." The Oak Ridge collection was stored in the basement archives, boxes of mundane school items, old textbooks, a tarnished school bell, attendance ledgers. But in a separate acid-free container, wrapped carefully in archival tissue, was a large format camera, its wooden body aged to a deep mahogany, brass fittings green with verdigris. "This was found hidden in a wall cavity during demolition," Patricia explained. "Quite valuable, actually. It's a modified Eastman View camera, probably from around 1910. The Historical Society wanted it for display, but there were some concerns about its condition. The lens assembly is unusual. I leaned closer, examining the camera without touching it. The lens was indeed strange, not a simple glass element, but a complex arrangement of crystal and metal, with what appeared to be a thin layer of some silvery substance applied to the innermost surface. Selenium, I murmured, remembering Jenkins' journal. Pardon? I straightened up. Nothing. Is it possible for me to examine this more closely, perhaps even test it? Patricia looked uncertain. It's not really procedure to allow handling of artifacts without specific research credentials. I reached into my wallet and removed several $100 bills, nearly all the cash I had left. I understand, but this is crucial for my research. I'd be happy to make a donation to the archives. She hesitated, then took the money. I need to attend to something upstairs. I'll be about 20 minutes. The camera is quite fragile, so be careful. As soon as she left, I carefully lifted the camera from its container. It was heavier than I expected, and I could feel an odd vibration emanating from it, as if the metal components were subtly humming. The nameplate on the base had been modified. The original manufacturer's mark scratched out and replaced with crudely etched words. Essence Extractor. I examined the lens more carefully. The silvery substance, selenium, according to Jenkins' journal, formed patterns across the glass that reminded me of a spider web or perhaps a mandala. At certain angles it seemed to shift and flow, though that might have been a trick of the light. On impulse, I took out my phone and snapped a photograph of the camera. The image appeared normal at first, but as I watched, the screen distorted, pixels bleeding into one another, until the picture dissolved into digital noise. Then my phone died completely. I looked up to find Patricia standing at the basement entrance, her face pale. "You need to leave," she said flatly. "Now. I'm not finished. There's someone here asking about you. A woman. She said you'd be interested in the camera." Patricia's voice shook slightly. "But there's something wrong with her face. It's like it's not there." A cold draft swept through the basement, and with it came the familiar smell of wet earth and that metallic undertone I now recognized as blood. "Where is she?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Patricia pointed upward. "Coming down the stairs." I could hear it now, the soft pad of small, bare feet on concrete steps. The lights in the basement flickered. I turned back to the camera, understanding flooding through me. This was what had started everything. This was what had taken Mary Sullivan's face and trapped her essence, and perhaps, just perhaps, it could undo what had been done. I grabbed the camera and ran toward the emergency exit at the far end of the basement, setting off alarms that wailed throughout the building. Behind me, I heard Patricia scream, then a sound like rushing water. The child had found another victim. I drove north into the mountains, the camera secured in my passenger seat with the seatbelt fastened around it. Every few minutes, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a small figure in a dark dress standing in the middle of the road behind me. The San Bernardino Mountains rose steep and imposing, still capped with snow, despite the late spring warmth in the valleys below. According to local histories I'd accessed at the archives, Harold Jenkins had owned a cabin near Big Bear Lake, in an area that was now largely abandoned after forest fires had ravaged it decades ago. Finding it proved easier than I had anticipated. An elderly park ranger at the visitor center recognized the name immediately when I claimed to be Jenkins' great-niece researching family history. "Jenkins Hollow," he said, pointing to a remote area on my map. "Not much there now. Most cabins burned down in '78. The Jenkins place was set further back, though, near the old creek bed. Might still be standing. Folks tended to avoid it even before the fire." "Any particular reason?" I asked. The ranger shrugged. "Just stories. People said Jenkins was odd, a recluse who'd sometimes be seen walking in the woods at night, carrying his camera even though it was too dark for photographs. After he died, hikers reported strange lights around his cabin, probably just teenagers messing around." I thanked him and headed deeper into the mountains, following increasingly narrow and deteriorating roads until finally my car could go no further. From there, I continued on foot, the camera wrapped in my jacket and cradled in my arms like an infant. Jenkins Hollow was a natural depression in the landscape, surrounded by towering pines and rocky outcroppings. As I descended the overgrown trail into the hollow, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The afternoon sun, so bright on the mountain road, barely penetrated the dense canopy here. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing, remarkably intact despite decades of abandonment. It was a simple structure, a single-story building with a steep roof and a stone chimney. The windows were boarded up from the inside, and the wooden exterior had weathered to a silvery grey that almost seemed to shimmer in the dappled light. I approached cautiously, the weight of the camera growing heavier in my arms. Something about the cabin felt wrong, as if the building itself existed slightly out of alignment with the world around it. The air near its walls appeared to waver, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. The front door was secured with a rusted padlock, but a window at the rear had partially rotted away, creating an opening large enough for me to climb through. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the peculiar stillness that comes from decades of abandonment. What little furniture remained was covered with yellowed sheets, like shrouded corpses. But it was the back wall of the cabin that immediately drew my attention. It had been converted into a makeshift darkroom and photography studio. A long table held the remnants of developing trays, chemical bottles with faded labels, and various photographic equipment in different stages of disassembly. Above the table, covering nearly the entire wall, was what could only be described as a shrine. Hundreds of photographs had been pinned to the wood, class pictures, portraits, group shots, spanning what appeared to be decades. In each one, at least one subject had the same distinctive anomaly, a face completely devoid of features. My hands trembling, I set Jenkins' camera on the table and moved closer to examine the photographs. They were arranged chronologically, starting with the Oak Ridge class photo from 1926, an exact duplicate of the one I'd found in my grandmother's belongings. Mary Sullivan stood in the back row, faceless, but she wasn't alone. As I traced the timeline of photographs across the wall, more faceless subjects appeared. A family portrait from 1927 showed a faceless father. A wedding photo from 1930 displayed a bride with a blank oval where her features should have been. On and on they went, year after year, each image containing Jenkins' signature violation, souls captured, faces erased. At the center of this grotesque collection was a large diagram drawn directly onto the wall, connecting certain photographs with red lines that converged at a crude drawing of what appeared to be Jenkins' camera. Scrawled around the diagram were fragments of text. Essence transference requires proximity plus connection, subject 0, MS. Remains most powerful conduit. Each new capture strengthens the apparatus, but weakens the veil. They are all connected through her. With growing horror, I realized what Jenkins had done. Mary Sullivan hadn't been an accident or a simple experiment. She had been the foundation, the conduit, through which he had continued his terrible work. Somehow, he had used her trapped essence to enhance his camera's ability to steal faces, to capture what he believed was the soul. And I had brought his camera back into the world. As this realization washed over me, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me, and the photographs on the wall began to tremble, as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. Water began to seep from beneath the floorboards, not rushing in as it had in my apartment, but rising slowly, deliberately, like a tide. The familiar smell of wet earth filled the space. I backed away from the wall, bumping into the table where I'd placed the camera. It had changed somehow. The tarnished metal now gleamed as if freshly polished, and the lens seemed to pulse with a faint, silvery light. From outside the cabin came the sound of humming, that same simple childish melody I'd heard in my apartment. But now it wasn't just one voice. It was many. A chorus of hollow, watery voices, all singing the same tune in eerie unison. I peered through a crack in the boarded window. Surrounding the cabin, barely visible among the trees, were figures, dozens of them, of all sizes and shapes. Men, women, children, all with the same terrible absence where their faces should have been. At the front, leading them toward the cabin, was the small figure in the dark dress. Mary Sullivan had found the others, all of Jenkins' victims, all the faces he had stolen over decades of his terrible work, and they had followed me to the source of their torment. As the water continued to rise around my ankles, I turned back to the camera. I understood now what I had to do. The camera had taken their faces, their essences. Perhaps it could restore them, but as I reached for it, the humming stopped abruptly. The cabin door, still locked from the outside, exploded inward with a spray of rotten wood and rusted metal. In the doorway stood Mary Sullivan, but she was changed. The void where her face should have been now swirled with that same darkness I'd seen in my apartment, but larger, more turbulent. It seemed to expand beyond the confines of her small head, reaching out in tendrils of pure absence. Behind her, the other faceless figures waited, water flowing constantly from their empty faces, pooling around their feet. "You brought it back," came Mary's voice, no longer childlike, but layered with dozens of other voices speaking in unison. "You brought him back." I clutched the camera to my chest. "I can fix this. I can give you back what he took." The darkness in Mary's non-face churned faster. "Too late. We are beyond reclaiming now." "Then what do you want?" I asked, my voice breaking. The answer came not from Mary, but from the camera in my hands. It suddenly grew hot, burning against my skin, yet I found myself unable to release it. The lens began to glow brighter, and from within its depths came a voice I hadn't heard before. Deep, resonant, male. "They want what they have always wanted," Jenkins' voice said, seeming to emanate from the very air around me. "To be complete again." I looked down in horror as the camera began to change, its wooden body softening like wax, flowing over my hands, up my arms. The metal components sank into my flesh, burning cold, while the glass of the lens pressed against my chest, directly over my heart. "The camera was never the true vessel," Jenkins' voice continued, sounding pleased. "It was merely the tool. I was the vessel, until my body failed me. I've been waiting for a new host, someone connected by blood to that day, someone who could bring them all together again." With dawning horror, I understood. My grandmother had been there in 1926. She had witnessed Mary's transformation. That connection, that thread of shared experience, had been passed down to me through blood and bone. "No!" I gasped, struggling against the camera as it continued to meld with my body. Mary stepped forward, the other faceless figures crowding in behind her. "We cannot be restored," the chorus of voices said, "but neither can we be forgotten." The water was at my waist now, impossibly deep given the small cabin. It moved with purpose, swirling around me, around the faceless figures, connecting us all in its cold embrace. The lens pressed harder against my chest, and I felt something inside me shifting, being pulled toward it. Not my heart or any physical organ, but something more essential, the very thing Jenkins had spent his life trying to capture. As darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision, I made one last, desperate attempt to break free. With all my remaining strength, I forced my hands upward, pressing the camera's lens away from my chest and toward the wall of photographs instead. "Take him!" I screamed. "Take Jenkins!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the lens flared with blinding intensity. From the wall of photographs, a dark mist began to emerge, seeping from each faceless subject, coalescing in the center of the room into a vaguely human shape. The camera jerked violently in my hands, its pull now directed toward this shadowy form rather than my chest. The lens pulsed, and the dark figure writhed as if in pain. "No!" It was Jenkins' voice, but distorted now, stretched thin with panic. "They are mine! Their essences belong to me!" The faceless figures moved as one, surrounding the dark manifestation that had once been Harold Jenkins. Water rose from all sides, enveloping the shadow in a swirling vortex. The camera in my hands vibrated with such intensity that I feared it would shatter. Mary stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to touch the lens. At the point of contact, a crack appeared in the glass, spreading rapidly across its surface. Light poured from the fractures, and the cabin filled with a high, keening sound that set my teeth on edge. "We take back what is ours," the chorus intoned. "We take you." The shadow that was Jenkins tried to retreat, to disperse, but the water held it fast. As the camera's lens shattered completely, the darkness was pulled inexorably inward, compressed into the small wooden box, even as it began to crumble in my hands. A final, inhuman scream echoed through the cabin as the last of the shadow disappeared into the ruined camera. The water receded instantly, leaving the floor dry as dust. The faceless figures remained, standing motionless in a circle around me. In my hands, the camera had been reduced to splinters of wood, twisted metal, and shards of glass, nothing remaining of its original form or function. I let the pieces fall to the floor, where they disintegrated further, becoming indistinguishable from the cabin's accumulated dust. Mary Sullivan stood before me, her faceless head tilted upward as if looking into my eyes. Slowly, impossibly, the blank surface of her non-face began to change. Features emerged, faint at first, then stronger, like a photograph gradually developing. A small nose, delicate lips, eyes that held both innocence and ancient knowledge. Around me, the other faceless figures underwent the same transformation, their stolen features returning, though transparent and ghostly, visible but not quite solid. "It is done," Mary said, her voice now singular and childlike again. "He is contained. The circle is broken. What happens now?" I whispered. Mary's newly formed lips curved into a sad smile. "Now we fade. Our time has long passed. We only remain to end what he began." She turned to leave, the other figures following her toward the broken doorway. As they moved into the sunlight outside, their forms became less distinct, dissipating like morning mist. Mary paused at the threshold, looking back at me one last time. "The photograph," she said. "Burn it. Let the last connection be severed." Then she was gone, along with all the others, leaving me alone in Jenkins' decaying cabin with nothing but dust, splinters, and the wall of photographs, now showing only ordinary people with ordinary, unremarkable faces. I didn't burn the photograph immediately. Something compelled me to return to San Bernardino first, to visit the site where Oak Ridge Elementary had once stood. The shopping center that had replaced it was unremarkable, a collection of chain stores surrounding a large parking lot. Nothing remained of the school that had witnessed Mary Sullivan's transformation nearly a century ago. Yet as I stood at the edge of the property, I felt a connection to this place and the events that had unfolded here. The photograph in my hands, retrieved from my car trunk after leaving the mountains, seemed heavier somehow, weighted with history and lost souls. I found a quiet corner of the parking lot and took out a lighter. The flame caught the edge of the old photograph quickly, the ancient paper curling and blackening. As the fire consumed the image, I watched the faces disappear one by one, including my grandmother's childish features, and in the back row, the now restored face of Mary Sullivan, visible to me for the first time. The ashes scattered in the breeze, and with them, I felt a burden lifting. Whatever connection had existed between me and Mary Sullivan, between my family and Jenkins' terrible work, was finally severed. My phone rang, the first time it had functioned properly since the archives. It was the San Francisco police. I answered, prepared to explain everything, but the detective on the other end surprised me. "We're calling about the flooding in your apartment building," he said. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Chen, reported a burst pipe that caused significant damage." "Mrs. Chen?" I echoed, confused. "But she was—" I stopped myself. She's filed an insurance claim and listed you as a witness. When can you come in to make a statement?" I learned later that no one had any memory of the faceless figures or the impossible water. The archives had no record of my visit or of Patricia's encounter with Mary Sullivan. The camera had never been part of their collection. My aunt was alive and well, with no recollection of our conversation in my flooded apartment. Reality had been restored, the ripples of Jenkins's violation smoothed away as if they had never existed. But I remembered, and sometimes, when I look at old photographs, I find myself scanning the faces carefully, looking for that telltale blur, that empty void where a person's identity should be. I've never found another, but I keep my distance from cameras nonetheless. A month after returning to San Francisco, I received a small package in the mail. No return address, just my name in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, not the Oak Ridge class picture, but a new one. A portrait of a young girl in early 20th century clothing, her face clear and smiling, her eyes bright with life. On the back, written in faded ink, Mary Sullivan, age 8, 1926. Remember. I keep it in my wallet now, this single image of a girl who both did and didn't die nearly a century ago. A reminder that some things cannot be captured, that the essence of who we are exists beyond any photograph or physical representation. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the fog rolls in, thick and heavy over San Francisco, I think I hear a child humming. Not a menacing sound anymore, but peaceful, distant, like a memory of something that can finally, after all these years, rest. 6 months after the events at Jenkins Hollow, I found myself standing before a gallery wall in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, staring at an exhibition titled Capturing Identity: Photography's Ethical Dilemmas. The centerpiece was a collection of historical photographs, alongside essays exploring how cameras had been viewed by different cultures throughout history. One panel caught my attention immediately. In certain indigenous cultures, photography was initially feared as a form of soul-stealing. The Navajo, for instance, believed that capturing a person's image could trap part of their spirit. In West Africa, some communities refused to be photographed, believing the camera could extract something essential from the subject. While often dismissed as primitive superstitions, these beliefs reflect a profound question about representation. What exactly is being taken when we capture someone's image? I had come to the exhibition hoping to understand more about Jenkins and his twisted experiments. What had driven him to modify his camera? What had he hoped to achieve by stealing faces, by trapping what he called essences? The exhibition offered no direct answers, but as I moved through the gallery, I began to piece together a broader context. Jenkins hadn't been working in isolation. The early 20th century had seen an explosion of interest in photography's potential to capture more than mere images, from spirit photography that claimed to reveal ghosts to scientific attempts to document the moment of death, believing the soul might be visible departing the body. A small placard beside a collection of modified cameras from the 1900-1930 period noted, "Photography's early practitioners were often seen as part alchemists, part scientists. Some believed that with the right modifications to equipment and chemical processes, a camera might reveal layers of reality invisible to the naked eye." Jenkins, it seemed, had merely taken this belief to its most extreme and most terrible conclusion. As I left the exhibition, a woman approached me. Elderly, elegant, with sharp eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked without preamble. I stepped back, startled. "Excuse me?" The emptiness. The void where a face should be. She smiled thinly. "You have the look, that particular awareness in your eyes that comes from seeing something you weren't meant to see." My heart raced. "Who are you?" "Someone like you. Someone who encountered Harold Jenkins' work." She glanced around the crowded gallery before continuing. "He wasn't the only one, you know. There were others experimenting with the same principles, a small group of photographers who called themselves essence extractors. Jenkins was simply the most successful. I felt cold, despite the museum's careful climate control. How do you know this? My father was one of them. Not as talented as Jenkins, thankfully. His modifications never quite worked, but he kept the group's records. She handed me a small card with an address. If you want to understand what happened to you, what happened to Mary Sullivan and all the others, come find me. Before I could respond, she melted into the crowd, leaving me clutching the card and wondering if the nightmare I thought had ended was merely beginning a new chapter. I didn't go to the address. Not that day, nor the next. I tried to convince myself that the woman had been mistaken, or perhaps mentally ill. That Jenkins had been a singular aberration, not part of some larger, organized effort to violate the boundary between image and soul. But the card remained on my nightstand, and with it questions that nagged at me through sleepless nights. What if there were other cameras like Jenkins, other photographers who had succeeded in their terrible experiments, other faceless victims trapped in photographs, waiting to be released? A week after the museum encounter, I dreamed of Mary Sullivan. Not the faceless horror that had pursued me, but the smiling girl from the portrait I kept in my wallet. In the dream, she stood in a sun-dappled schoolyard, alive and whole. "They're still out there," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "The others like him. The ones who take what isn't theirs to take." I woke with the certainty that I couldn't ignore the elderly woman's invitation. Whatever peace I had found after burning the Oak Ridge photograph was temporary at best. I needed to know the full truth. The address led me to a Victorian house in Pacific Heights, immaculately maintained and surrounded by a wrought-iron fence. The woman herself answered the door, now dressed in a formal blouse and skirt that emphasized her age and frailty. "I wondered if you would come," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "Most don't. They prefer to forget what they've seen, to pretend it was imagination or madness." The interior of the house was a stark contrast to its traditional exterior. The walls covered with photographs, diagrams, and maps connected by red string. Reminiscent of Jenkins' shrine, but more methodical, more researched. "My name is Elizabeth Carver," she said, leading me into what had once been a formal dining room, but was now an improvised archive. "My father was William Carver, one of the founding members of the Essence Extractors. He kept detailed records of the group's activities from 1915 until his death in 1943. She gestured to the table, where leather-bound journals similar to Jenkins lay open alongside modern printouts and newspaper clippings. "I've spent my life tracking them," she continued, "at first to understand my father's obsession, then to stop what it had become. Jenkins wasn't the worst of them, merely the first to succeed. Others refined his techniques. Some are still active today." I sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the wall of information before me. Dates, locations, names, photographs. So many photographs, spanning decades, all with the same distinctive anomaly. Faces erased, identities stolen. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Elizabeth's expression hardened. "Because you broke the cycle. You freed Mary Sullivan and the others connected to Jenkins. You might be able to help me free the rest." "I destroyed the camera," I said. "It's over." She shook her head slowly. "You destroyed one camera, but the knowledge, the technique, it survived. It evolved." She pointed to a modern digital camera mounted on the wall, modified with unfamiliar attachments. "They don't need selenium and glass plates anymore. They've found new ways to extract essences, new technologies to trap souls." "Who are they?" "They call themselves the Faceless. Photographers who believe they're preserving something precious, something that would otherwise be lost when a person dies. They see themselves as archivists of the human spirit." Her voice dripped with contempt. "In reality, they're collectors, hoarders of stolen identities." I stared at the digital camera, its lens seeming to watch me with malevolent interest. "What do you want from me?" Elizabeth sat across from me, her hands folded on the table. "Help me find them. Help me destroy their cameras and free their victims. You have a connection now. Mary Sullivan opened a door for you. You can see what others can't. I thought of my aunt, of Mrs. Chen, of the archivist Patricia, all touched by the impossible water, all now with no memory of what had happened. I thought of the faceless figures in the forest, finally at peace after nearly a century of torment. If I help you, I said slowly, what happens when we find them? Elizabeth smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We give back what was taken. We restore the balance. As she spoke, I noticed a photograph on the wall behind her, a family portrait from the 1930s. A man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling stiffly for the camera. The man's face was intact, but something about his eyes troubled me. They seemed to look not at the camera but through it, with the same penetrating awareness Elizabeth had noted in mine. With a shock, I recognized William Carver from the journal photographs, Elizabeth's father, the man who had helped create the very horror his daughter now claimed to fight. And I wondered, not for the first time, what I had truly become entangled in, what forces I had disturbed when I opened that box containing my grandmother's school photograph and gazed upon the face of a girl who had no face at all. I agreed to help Elizabeth Carver, but not for the reasons she believed. Something about her story didn't align with my experience. Subtle inconsistencies, details that contradicted what I had learned from Jenkins's journal and my own encounter with Mary Sullivan. Most troubling was Elizabeth's insistence that the faceless victims needed to be freed through a specific ritual involving the original cameras. According to Jenkins' journal, the cameras were merely tools. The true vessels were the photographers themselves. Destroying Jenkins' camera had been effective only because his essence had somehow remained connected to it after his death. I played along, letting Elizabeth believe I was committed to her cause while conducting my own investigation. I borrowed materials from her archive, carefully photographing pages from her father's journals and the maps marking supposed locations of faceless activity. What emerged was a pattern more disturbing than Elizabeth had revealed. The essence extractors hadn't been a small group of experimental photographers. They had been a cult, obsessed with capturing and preserving what they called the pure soul, before it could be corrupted by modern life. Their victims hadn't been random. They had been selected for their perceived purity or spiritual potential. More disturbingly, William Carver's later journals suggested that the cult hadn't sought to trap souls out of mere curiosity or obsession. They believed they were creating a reservoir of spiritual energy, a collection of essences that could eventually be harnessed for some greater purpose. The final entry in Carver's journal, dated just days before his death in 1943, read, "The convergence approaches. The vessel is nearly prepared. When enough essences have been gathered, the transformation can begin." What convergence or transformation referred to remained unclear, but the implications were unsettling enough for me to distance myself from Elizabeth and her mission. I made excuses about needing time, about being unprepared for the work ahead. She seemed to accept my reluctance, though her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You've seen their power," she reminded me as I left her house. "You know what they're capable of. Don't wait too long to decide whose side you're on." I spent the following weeks cross-referencing the information I'd gathered from Elizabeth with public records, historical documents, and obscure photography forums online. A pattern began to emerge, not of ongoing, faceless activity as Elizabeth had claimed, but of something else entirely. The essence extractors had indeed continued their work after Jenkins and Carver, but their approach had changed. Instead of stealing faces from the living, they had shifted to capturing the essence at the moment of death, specifically the deaths of their own members. A photographer named Martin Reeves had modified the technique in the 1950s, creating what he called a soul transference device that could extract the essence of a dying person and preserve it in a photographic plate. The first subject had been Reeves himself, terminally ill with cancer and determined to achieve a form of immortality. According to records I found in a digital archive of paranormal research, Reeves had successfully transferred his consciousness into his final photograph. His body had died, but observers reported that his image in the photograph moved independently, his eyes following people around the room. This revelation cast Elizabeth's mission in a different light. She wasn't trying to free victims. She was trying to locate and destroy the preserved essences of the original essence extractors, including her father. She was attempting to eradicate the cult, not out of moral outrage, but to eliminate competitors or threats. When I stopped responding to Elizabeth's increasingly insistent calls, she came to my apartment. I refused to let her in, speaking through the closed door. "I know what you're really doing," I told her. "I know about the convergence." There was a long silence from the other side of the door. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, deeper, resonant with an authority that hadn't been present before. "You understand nothing," she said. "The essence extractors were misguided. Their methods were crude, their vision limited. What I seek is completion, not collection." "What does that mean?" I asked, my hand on the doorknob despite my better judgment. "Every photograph takes something from its subject, a moment, an expression, a version of self that can never exist again. Most cameras take only shadows, echoes. The modified cameras took more, the essence, the face, the identity. But the ultimate camera, the true vessel, will take everything and give everything. Perfect preservation, perfect transformation." A chill ran through me. "You're not trying to destroy the cameras, you're trying to perfect them." "My father started this work, I am finishing it." Her voice took on an almost reverent quality. "The convergence is not an event, it is a state of being. All faces, all essences, all identities merged into one perfect whole. No more theft, no more loss, only perfect preservation." I backed away from the door. "You're insane." "I'm evolved," she corrected, "and I had hoped you would join me willingly given your connection to Mary Sullivan. But I see now that was optimistic." Water began to seep beneath my door. Not the rushing flood that had accompanied Mary Sullivan's manifestation, but a deliberate, measured flow. It wasn't driven by vengeance or loss, but by calculated purpose. I ran to my bedroom, grabbing the small portrait of Mary Sullivan from my wallet. It had been my talisman, my reminder that the nightmare was real and that it had ended. Now I held it before me like a ward as the water continued to spread across my floor. "She freed me," I called out. "Mary Sullivan broke the connection. You have no power over me." Elizabeth laughed, a sound that seemed to come not just from beyond the door, but from the water itself. Mary Sullivan was a child, a crude first attempt. What she experienced was a primitive extraction. What I offer is transcendence. The water reached my feet, but unlike before, it felt warm, almost welcoming. Where it touched my skin, I felt a curious lightness, as if some burden I hadn't known I carried was being lifted away. I looked down at the portrait in my hands. Mary Sullivan's face was changing, her features blurring not into emptiness, but into something else. Something both more and less than human. A composite of countless faces, shifting and flowing like the water at my feet. With horror, I realized what Elizabeth had become. Not a faceless victim or a soul-stealing photographer, but something new. A convergence point for all the stolen essences, all the captured faces. She had found a way to absorb them, to integrate them into her own being. The door to my apartment burst open, though no physical force had been applied. In the doorway stood Elizabeth Carver, but transformed. Her elderly frame seemed to contain multitudes, her face a shifting kaleidoscope of features that included men, women, children of all ages and eras. Among them, I glimpsed Mary Sullivan, Jenkins himself, and countless others I didn't recognize. "This is completion," the thing that had been Elizabeth said, its voice a chorus of countless souls speaking in unison. This is preservation. This is the true purpose of the camera. Not to steal, but to save. Not to separate, but to unite. The water swirled around me, rising rapidly now. In my hands, Mary Sullivan's portrait dissolved into liquid, running between my fingers like mercury. I felt my own face beginning to soften, my features becoming fluid, ready to join the composite being before me. In that moment of dissolution, of impending absorption, I understood a terrible truth. Jenkins, Carver, all the essence extractors, they had never been the true threat. They had been merely preparing the way, gathering the components for the emergence of something greater and more terrible. Elizabeth Carver hadn't been fighting the cult. She had been its culmination, its perfect vessel. As my identity began to merge with the water, with the chorus, with the collective that had once been separate souls, I made one final desperate effort to retain myself. I focused on my grandmother's face in that original school photograph, on her connection to Mary Sullivan, on the thread of history that had led me here. The water faltered for just a moment, long enough for me to break free, to run past the thing in my doorway and into the night. Behind me, I heard a sound like 1,000 voices sighing in disappointment. I don't know if I truly escaped that night, or if Elizabeth merely let me go, confident that the convergence would eventually claim me along with everyone else. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of my reflection and see features that aren't my own, briefly superimposed over mine. Echoes of Mary Sullivan, of Harold Jenkins, of all those connected to the terrible legacy of the essence extractors. I've moved far from San Francisco, changed my name, abandoned my former life. I avoid cameras completely, no photographs, no video calls, not even security cameras if I can help it. I know Elizabeth is still out there, still gathering essences, still working toward her perfect convergence. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see her face, not the elderly woman I met, but the composite being she became, with its 1,000 shifting features all yearning for completion, all calling me home. The school photograph that started it all is long gone, burned to ash and scattered. But its legacy continues, a ripple through time that began with a child losing her face in 1926 and extends into a future I cannot bear to imagine. A future where the boundary between self and other, between individual and collective, dissolves like features in developing fluid, leaving behind only the perfect, terrible convergence. A future where we all eventually become faceless,